was the real story there? What were they
Right.
framing? Why are they trying to get him out?
Yeah, no, this is not a defense of Nixon.
Yeah,
Nixon was not a
exactly.
great guy. But Tucker thinks that Nixon knew about too much about the JFK assassination and wanted to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he started saying, I know who killed JFK.
Of course, the hottest topic on Twitter has been this Ian Carroll interview on Joe Rogan. I am going to have to make a big series out of this just because there's so much to go over. Some of the stuff that is wrong isn't stuff that Ian Carroll says. It's Joe Rogan. And I'm sorry, but I think that that's the problem with getting your views fed to you by people who are podcasters, albeit they're very interesting and intelligent, but they get wrong on the details. And I think that it's good that at least they tell you do your own research, because that advice will come in handy, because you'll see how they treat the first topic, which is President Ford and how he got into office.
This motherfucker out of here.
Yeah.
And also, one of the terms that he had agreed to run for president has Gerald Ford, who was on the fucking Warren Commission.
Bingo.
Gerald Ford as his
Yep.
VP.
Yep.
So Gerald Ford becomes the first ever non-elected president. He slips in. He becomes president for kind of a bullshit term.
Yep.
And
does a whole bunch of war party
yeah,
things and just a whole bunch of bullshit.
And we decide that Nixon was the real problem with the country.
I mean, how often is it that they're allowing someone that they aren't sure about to get to president, and they're sticking them with a VP that is their guy, right?
Oh,
like
yeah, Dick Cheney.
LBJ with JFK.
Dick Cheney. Everybody.
Mike
it was the
Pence,
hidden
like-
secret that, well,
You have them freestyling here and talking about how Richard Nixon had been pushed out of office because he had been allegedly threatening to disclose details about the JFK assassination that the CIA or the FBI wanted under wrap. If you go a little further back, they were saying that Joe Rogan was saying that he thought that Tucker had told him this.
yeah, no, this is not a defense of Nixon.
Yeah,
Nixon was not a
exactly.
great guy. But Tucker thinks that Nixon knew about too much about the JFK assassination and wanted to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he started saying, I know who killed JFK.
Everything about this is broken telephone. These guys are not looking at the full picture. And yeah, there is something interesting going on here, but what are they saying about President Ford? So this is all verifiable fact. You don't really have to do too much digging, but if you want, you can go take a look. He was not forced on President Nixon in order to get elected. This is false on its face. So Nixon ran for president 3 times. The first time he ran, he lost. John Cabot Lodge was his running mate. In fact, that was an interesting choice. I think he does have some connections with the CIA back then. But in 1968 and 1972, he won with Spiro Agnew as his running mate. And Spiro Agnew is actually a more interesting character because of how he got pushed out of office. To cut to the chase, Spiro Agnew was pushed out in 1974 after Nixon had been reelected to his second term. This is an ethics case study from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And contractors were giving kickbacks to Maryland politicians, and Spiro Agnew had been the governor of Maryland.
What was the ultimate downfall of the Vice President of the United States? What was his crime? Well, his crime wasn't accepting the bribe or accepting the kickback. His crime was it was the Al Capone crime. He didn't put it on his income tax. And so thus they had him for income tax evasion. Back in the 70s, there were not what I view to be RICO and public sector statutes that strictly prohibited it. Today, clearly it would.
It's a very simple issue. Nixon had vetted him, and it turned out that Spiro Agnew was a very corrupt guy. He might have been an earlier day template for Joe Biden in that he was accepting money in a much more simple, straightforward manner. He was actually receiving the money straight up. Apparently, even when Nixon was already in the White House and Agnew was serving alongside him, he wasn't declaring it as part of his income tax. So at the time, there was no shielding, and inquiries in Maryland led to Agnew, and they forced him to resign. What about some of the other stuff that he goes into right after that? Okay, what about the allegations that he was a warmonger? Well, you can actually look at Gerald Ford's record. He was president for, I think, less than 3 years. And you can look through some of these details. So he continued to practice détente with the Soviet Union. This was a policy that Nixon had issues that would be of mutual benefit. So they ended up getting together to sign the Helsinki Accords, which recognized existing boundaries of European countries established at the end of World War II. Added on to the SALT Accords, that's a strategic arms and limitation treaty that limited production of nuclear weapons. He did not intervene when the Vietnam War erupted again. So when the Vietnam War ended in 1973 officially, and the U.S. involvement militarily in Vietnam ceased, Nixon had committed to intervening if the North would violate the terms of the Paris Peace Accords. But when that actually happened under Ford in December 1974, he didn't actually take any action because Congress would not authorize it. They also wouldn't authorize about $722 million of military aid, which translates to $4.23 billion in 2025. He allowed South Vietnam to fall to the north, and that led to the infamous withdrawal from Saigon of all U.S. embassy personnel, which was one of the more embarrassing episodes in U.S. foreign policy, and not from a warmongering standpoint. There was also an incident that happened later where an American cargo ship was seized by Cambodia called the Mayaoez, and Ford sent Marines in order to rescue it in what ended up being a rather fruitless mission, which was actually solved through negotiation afterward. But he also participated in reforming the CIA, which came about because of disclosures of the family jewels. Now, Ford said that he didn't know about the family jewels from when he was Speaker of the House or a member of Congress or a member of the Warren Commission. But the fact is that as president, okay, you can call him a warmonger, but there is no evidence. Because under him, Congress actually undertook to reform the CIA in the most comprehensive way that we know of today, the Church Committee. Whether this actually cleaned the CIA, I think we probably know it didn't do the whole thing, but it led to the director, William Colby, losing his job in 1975, as it says here. So, in general, if you look at the broad outline of Ford's policy, he was actually anything but a warmonger. But there's actually something, if you look at the whole conversation between Rogan and Ian Carroll, that should be of interest that they never even cover, because they're not working off of their own research, and it's not even hard research to do. They are working often off of things that other people have told them to look in. One of the main things that they were talking about was the role that Gerald Ford had with the Warren Commission, and then also the Kennedy assassination. And therefore you would expect, if Gerald Ford was this establishment shill who was trying to cover things up, how would his relationship have been with Israel? Well, as it turns out, in 1975, in March, there was shuttle diplomacy over a disengagement in the Sinai Peninsula. So this was after the Yom Kippur War, and Kissinger and the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin didn't end up seeing eye to eye. So President Ford actually wrote a message to Yitzhak Rabin where he says, "I wish to express my profound disappointment over Israel's attitude during the course of the negotiations. I have given instructions for a reassessment of United States policy in the region, including our relations with Israel, with the aim of ensuring that our overall American interests are protected. This reassessment resulted in the suspension of economic assistance and a reduction of arms supply to Israel." So they were getting economic assistance withheld at that time. That was part of the foreign aid package. It's not economic assistance today. And arms being supplied. So that was also being withheld. What did the U.S. Congress do after Gerald Ford did this? 76 senators wrote to the president stressing that we believe that preserving the peace requires that Israel obtain a level of military and economic support adequate to deter a renewal of war by Israel's neighbors. Withholding military equipment from Israel would be dangerous, discouraging accommodation by Israel's neighbors, and encouraging a resort to force. The Congress, going over the head of President Ford, to send arms at low interest rates to Israel. And then later, there was a negotiation that did bring about an Egyptian-Israeli disengagement in September 1975. Now, what else happened?
September 5th, 1975. A day in Sacramento, former Secret Service agent Larry Boondorf recalls in vivid detail.
They try to put it into slow motion, and there's no slow motion about it.
Boondorf says President Gerald Ford was supposed to be led by motorcade to the California State Capitol for a speech.
He walked out of the hotel that morning, saw it was a beautiful day. It was always beautiful in Sacramento. Walked out, said, "I think I'll walk." Well, that was not in the plan.
They quickly established a perimeter of the sidewalk, Boondorf right at Ford's left shoulder, as the president shook people's hands, and among the crowd.
And even though that she was dressed completely in red, which she stood out, according to Ford, he noticed that right away.
Member of the Manson family, Lynette Squeaky Fromm.
Up came this 45 that she had strapped to her ankle.
That's when Boondorf says.
So a member of Charles Manson's family attempted to murder President Ford. And 17 days later, we don't have time today, there was another member of the family who attempted to murder President Ford. So all of this, by coincidence, the same month that there is this disengagement agreement between Israel and Egypt. So why won't the conspiracy hounds look at that? Because they're not doing their own research. Now, I personally don't have any reason to believe that the two are connected, but why wouldn't you at least tell the truth about Ford's record if you're really about looking at history as it was, as opposed to believing in narratives? To think that President Ford, who actually suspended U.S. aid to Israel, who did not intervene when South Vietnam was steamrolled in violation of the Paris Peace Accords, who continued with diplomacy with the Soviet Union and China, to think that he was a warmonger means that you have bought into a narrative. It means that you aren't really learning about who he was. Now, maybe he wasn't the give peace a chance president, but at least if you're Joe Rogan, look and do what would be considered your own due diligence. Stop just listening to people that are on your show. That's the criticism that I have. Not that these people are getting any attention. They themselves don't really look into the big picture about any of the people that they're talking about and assume the worst because it fits in with their own worldview.